Welcome back to the Management Lab. I'm trying to do this with as much enthusiasm as I can here. I'm Sean Hansen from Saunders College of Business at Rochester Institute of Technology.
And I'm Rory Goff from the University of Sydney Business School. That was all right, Sean. I approve.
I don't want to sound like a sportscaster, but I gotta add some energy. I remember back when I was in high school, I was once asked to do the morning announcements, and afterwards, one of my best friends was like, "Yeah, you got to do it with a little more oomph." And this guy was not exactly a public speaker, so I took umbrage at telling me I had to do it with more oomph.
I can picture you as a sports announcer. You have the right voice for it.
Nice. I'll take it.
Yeah, I could see that. Anyway, how have you been?
Great. My Buckeyes, as a native Ohioan, I follow the Ohio State Buckeyes, and they won the national championship last week.
Wait,
so that was fun.
Are you talking about college football? Is that what it is?
Yeah, college football.
All right.
Yes.
So that's Ohio State, right?
Yes.
All right. Congratulations.
My Cavaliers are also in first place right now. So
are they really?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
We had a bit of a rough stretch last week, or over the last week. But
who's leading the team? Like, who's their main player?
Donovan Mitchell would probably be he's the star, but they got a bunch of. A guy named Evan Mobley is really coming into his own. He's a third-year guy. Jared Allen's their center, who's a strong big. Darius Garland is their point guard.
I've stopped following that when I left Cleveland, I think many years ago when LeBron was still there.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've had an interesting couple of weeks since we last spoke. Maybe one of the most prominent events to have taken place since then is the arrival of DeepSeek. Have you heard of that? Have you been?
Yeah, that was this week particularly, right?
Yeah. Just a few days ago. What do you make of that?
Well, it freaked the market out, right? So it's this new Chinese AI platform, and the big innovation, or the big thing that they are suggesting, is that they can match the U.S.-based OpenAI and other U.S.-based AI innovators with much lower computing power, right?
Yeah.
With purportedly running on pretty simple machines. And so the biggest hit on the market, as far as I could tell, was a huge sell-off in NVIDIA, which is a maker of these high-end chips.
Yes.
So
they lost
it seemed
like
it freaked out the tech sector pretty.
Yeah, they lost $500 billion in value in like one day, I think, of trading.
Yeah.
But I think they've bounced back a little bit since then.
So my take on this is, as with all the political things that have been coming out over the last week, is really trying to adopt a wait and see stance, because I think it remains to be seen what the true upshot of a lot of these things is going to be. And the same thing seems to be the case with DeepSeek, because I don't know if you saw this, but OpenAI has already brought suits against them, claiming that they basically ripped off a bunch of their technology. So
I find that's so ironic. Like OpenAI, who've stolen data from the entire world and are facing themselves a bunch of lawsuits for all sorts of reasons, are now, crying wolf. Not crying wolf, that's not the right phrase, but they're complaining about somebody else who doesn't play by the rules. I find that a bit ironic. And another thing I thought was interesting about this was, have you played around with this at all? Because I have.
No, not at all. Yeah.
So one of the first things that I did, given that it's based in China, was to ask it a bunch of, controversial questions about China. So I asked it what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And the response was, "It's beyond the scope of my knowledge. Let's talk about something else." And the same thing happened, and many people have tried different variations of this, right? So I've also asked it, "Who's the president of Taiwan?" And I got the same response. And So a bunch of these controversial questions, apparently there's guardrails that have been baked into the system, such that it doesn't talk about this. Even more weirdly, sometimes it will actually start producing text on the screen, and then it will pull the text back and give this response that I mentioned before. It's beyond the scope of my knowledge, which is that's a weird. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes there, but it's kind of a weird thing.
It's second guessing itself. Oh, I shouldn't share this.
I don't know what happened there exactly, but it's based in China. It's a Chinese company, and it's hosted in China. So I think, it would be wise of people to approach it with caution. Now, of course, it's completely open source, right? So
Yeah.
it's possible to host it in other countries, and I know a bunch of companies have already started doing this. So if it's hosted in other places, then all these, privacy and security issues, I guess they diminish. But I think it's sort of something to keep in mind still.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw a couple of weeks ago, they as this plan for TikTok shutting down was approaching before President Trump
Yeah.
basically remanded it. Um, but as that was approaching, the China came out with a brand new platform, a brand new social media platform.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
understanding is I don't recall what the name of it was, but that it translated to Little Red Book.
Yeah.
And most people were maybe I shouldn't jump to conclusions, but my impression is that most people were not educated enough to catch that reference. It's kind of a significant reference.
Well, you're referring to the Communist Manifesto or something?
No, Mao's Little Red Book.
Oh,
So
right. Yeah.
Chairman Mao's ideological articulation of his platform was called the Little Red Book.
Okay. Yeah. No, the Trump 180 is it's so blatant to the point that it's ridiculous. Like there's so much stuff going on that we don't really pick up on this and have a serious discussion, because it's obvious that one of the main stakeholders in TikTok is I think it's the second individual most significant donor to his campaign.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how many tens of millions that person donated to him. I forget. It's something Yas, right? That's the person's name.
I don't recall his name.
Yeah.
We could look it up, but yeah, it was. He is a large donor, and I
Yeah.
believe he was at all the inauguration events and things like that.
Oh, well, the TikTok CEO was there. I mean, there's not even an attempt
right.
to mask anything. It's right out there in the open. And I mean, the fact that Trump was one of the initiators of the ban in the first place on TikTok, and now he did a complete 180, it's just, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But that's where we're at.
Certainly questionable.
But, both, the silver lining, as it were, with both of these things is like we mentioned before, issues of privacy and surveillance, because TikTok for sure, and I don't know, to me, any Chinese company based in China that collects massive amounts of data is a privacy risk. And that relates to the topic of our conversation today, which is surveillance in the workplace. Yeah. Which I think I picked that topic. Is that correct? Yeah, I think I proposed it. And I find it interesting.
Are you gonna claim credit for every topic that
I'm gonna claim credit for every topic that I proposed? So maybe it's
because you veto all my topics.
You really want to do that here? Let's do that here.
Airing dirty laundry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, surveillance is interesting, right? Because I guess it's been around in the workplace forever, since there have been organizations. People have watched their employees, to make sure that they comply with the expectations and that they are productive to a degree with what they do. But over the course of time, and specifically with the rise of different digital technologies, and in the last couple of years, AI specifically, there's been a rise in the scope and magnitude of surveillance. It's become much more comprehensive, I guess, and the gaze has broadened significantly. And so I thought it was interesting because, on the one hand, obviously there's productive reasons to surveil or monitor your employees, right? Because we want to make sure that they do what we expect them to do. But is there a limit to how much we should do this? Is there an ethical reason why we should kind of stop at a certain point? And also other practical reasons to not overdo this, right? Because at some point, employees might actually perceive this as a negative thing, as an intrusion, a liability, and that actually make them less productive. So I thought it was an interesting topic to look at, and we've reviewed the literature and looked at a bit of research, and so that's what we're going to talk and elaborate on today.
Yeah. And one of the things that I do think we should underscore, actually, is there's a significant extent to which this topic is really a blending of two of the topics we talked about previously, which is remote work and emotional AI. So we'll talk about the emotional AI piece, but it's very clear to me that this digital surveillance, digital workplace surveillance, has been categorically changed by the pandemic. Because the pandemic led to people working remotely, right? This massive movement toward remote work. It was really the lever for implementing a lot of these surveillance technologies. And people, because it was sort of a condition for their continued employment, just went along with it.
Yeah.
And certainly, we can talk about sort of the employee perceptions of it, but it's very clear that they sort of seeded the ground, that they meaning everyone, right? Sort of seeded the ground because it was, under the pandemic, if I have to work from home, and if I have to work from home and I'm told I have to adopt these technologies to enable that, then okay, I'll do it to keep my job and to keep my livelihood. But it has created a phase. What's the phrase for like a categorical jump like that? Phase transition, or
yeah, that sounds about right.
A real phase transition in terms of the use of the technology, because again, everyone just adopted it, but it's a fundamental difference it's fundamentally different from a lot of the previous modes of surveillance that employers were using. You're right that employee surveillance or workplace surveillance is not something new, but it is going to an entirely different place with the adoption of these digital technologies.
Yeah, so according to some reports, surveillance levels in the workplace have doubled since COVID.
Since the pandemic?
Doubled. And so I think you're right. I think the remote work aspect of it has certainly enabled or even, pushed forward some of these trends that were already in place, but to a much larger degree. Because I think some employers were probably trying, to in a way overcompensate, because it's one thing when you see the person right in front of you sitting in the office, you can sort of see what they're doing and you can talk to them. And there's a certain degree of security in knowing that they're there and doing their job in one way or another. But when you're physically not present and you can't actually see the other person, I guess the levels of concern go up, and then you plug in all these digital surveillance tools to make sure that people are compliant.
So close that gap. Yeah.
Let's look at a few stats just so that everybody understands the prominence of the phenomenon, like to what degree people are surveilled in the workplace. And we've looked at a couple of different reports. So let me throw a bunch of numbers at you, and if anything sticks or is particularly interesting, let me know. So in 2022, the New York Times found that 8 in 10 of the largest private sector businesses use some form of surveillance. So 80% of large businesses surveil the employees in one way or another. Another report by the International Data Corporation found that nearly 70% of North American employers use some form of monitoring or surveillance. Another report found something very similar. 68% of workers that report some form of e-monitoring, and these can be things like productivity monitoring using a camera, location monitoring, and things of that nature. So it's definitely something that's there. Most people are roughly, if you kind of do a rough average across the different reports, it's about 3/4 of people, of workers that are monitored by their employers.
Yeah. So a couple of things did jump out. I mean, number one, the huge numbers, right? And certainly that warrants some review and scrutiny. I guess one of the questions that I had, and I can go back and look at the definitions, but there's sort of a open question as to what counts as surveillance technology, right? Because we will talk through a couple technologies that seem quite invasive, but is something as simple as a timesheet surveillance technology, right? Is clocking in and clocking out surveillance technology, or would that be included in that 80% figure for large organizations? Or is it only the things that are more like screen capture, or not only, is it also things like screen capture, keyboard logging, camera, video surveillance, the more invasive forms?
Yeah, so I think the numbers that I mentioned are specific to digital monitoring, right? So clocking in or, stamping your card, I don't think that would count as surveillance based on this.
Yeah, but I don't mean a traditional time clock. I mean even logging into your work systems. I think maybe status logging would certainly be included. So, for example, my wife works a couple days a week. She works remote, and then three out of 5 days she goes into the office. But wherever they're working, they have to log into the system and they have to keep their status up to date. So am I available? Am I in meetings? Am I on break? And you actually have to clock out at lunch and that sort of thing. I mean,
Really?
that's all digital. It's not a physical time clock like back first time I worked in a factory back in high school. It's not that kind of thing. It's a digital platform. But yeah, they need to clock out and clock back in and that sort of thing. And on their, I think it's Teams, maybe like one of those platforms, one of those collaboration systems where they have to have their status up to date so that people know when they can reach them.
And what is it being monitored on a regular basis by somebody?
I don't believe so. So that's a good question. I don't believe it's being. I think status is being checked all the time because a member of your team wants to reach out and they send you a text and you don't respond. They might be more inclined to say, "Hey, why aren't you responding?" As opposed to if they're labeled as in a meeting or on lunch, then then there might be a little expectation of a longer time frame.
Yeah, I think one of the potentially, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here a little bit, and we might get back to this later, but I think one of the potentially nefarious things about these technologies is that you don't actually know if you're being watched or surveilled at any given point in time. And because you don't know that for a fact, you have to behave as if somebody is watching you all the time. And that has the effect of people disciplining themselves, right? To the point of becoming completely compliant with with their perceived expectations of what the employers want them to do.
Yeah, it's the Panopticon effect, right?
That's the Panopticon effect, yeah, in a way, digital Panopticon, which is a term taken from, actually, Foucault kind of popularized it, but I think it was Jeremy Bentham who came up with it.
It goes back to Bentham, yeah. So the original idea, by the way, of the Panopticon was like for the design of a prison. What's the perfect design for a prison? Well, it's one in which all the cells are visible from a central tower, and the inmates never know if someone's in that tower watching them.
Yeah.
So they therefore have to assume that someone's always watching them, and they'll behave themselves if they assume they're always being watched. And so I think the metaphor is actually quite apt, because the idea is even if someone's not actively monitoring you on a constant basis, if they have the ability to do so, then do you assume that they are?
Yeah.
And behave in ways that they want you to behave.
So let's give a couple of examples of these tools so that everybody knows what we're talking about. Although I mentioned, given the numbers we mentioned before, many people would know some of these tools. Although I should mention another stat that I thought was interesting, let me see if I can find it real quick, was the degree of awareness of employees that they're being monitored and how they're being monitored. So the number was, there it is, only 32% of employees report receiving clear guidelines or policies regarding the monitoring of their online activities in the workplace.
Yeah.
So there's a great deal of opaqueness, of lack of transparency around how people are being surveilled. So even if you know that you are, because it's not entirely clear how you're being watched.
Yeah. I wonder if that's kind of like a service level agreement type effect, right? All of us download software all the time and agree to terms and conditions that no one reads, right? And I wonder if in the employment agreements or organizational policies, it's sort of like, well, it's out there, but no one's going to go look into it.
I mean, I can tell you from my workplace, I mean, who knows what I signed when I joined it? I don't think it was in place there. But about 2 or 3 years ago, so everybody who uses a computer from work, and I had one, we were instructed, how you sometimes get instructions to download something.
Mm-hmm.
And we were asked to download an app that was basically watching everything that you did in your machine. And if you didn't watch...
really?
And if you didn't download it, you wouldn't be able to use it anymore, or some functionality would go away from the system. So that was the day when I stopped using that machine, and
interesting.
And I switched to a personal laptop. But yeah, they just roll it out, and that becomes the new norm. That was the case with my workplace anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, because I think universities are actually a domain where surveillance tends to be much lower. I don't think our students have any fear that their usage on campus is being monitored, and or employees worrying about, emailing friends. One of the things that we saw in one of these studies is one of the biggest concerns that people had was that their communications with friends and relatives would be monitored.
Yeah. Oh, what websites do you visit?
Yeah, that's the one that seems like, obviously, why would a firm, not make sure that you're not doing nefarious things online? But communications with friends and relatives maybe seems more invasive to me.
Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. So there's and by the way, these are taken from a report from an outfit, a think tank in Austria called Crack Labs, which I've been following for a while. They're doing a really good job, really good work around producing reports that pertain to different forms of surveillance and privacy in society. So this one comes from one that they devoted to surveillance in the workplace. And they give a number of examples of tools that are used. One of them is called Solonis, or I guess that's the company, and they have a service or a software package that is specific to call centers. So it enables people to track every stage of the call, from when the worker picks up to discussing the reason for the call, and when the call is resolved, it checks how closely the employee is following a pre-configured script that they're expected to follow, whether they offer to sell any like upsale or cross sales and things of that nature, like how proactive they are and how efficient they're being. And it also, which is kind of alarming, follows the sentiment of the worker throughout the call, and that's inferred from their tone of voice.
Yeah,
right. So it's a fairly.
So that's an emotional AI piece that we might get into more.
Yeah. Just kind of trying to infer and monitor your emotions, your affect, and how you utilize that in your work. That's a pretty I don't know. It's a weird one, and yes, we'll get back to this later. Microsoft have a bunch of tools that are utilized for surveillance and tracking of workers in the workplace. One of them is called SIEM. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. CM, Security Information and Event Management. And a similar thing that has kind of a similar functionality from a company called ForcePoint. And what these tools do is that they allow employers rather to monitor and analyze file activity, like on people's machines, computers, clipboard activity, so copy and paste, right? That tracks that. What applications you use, browser activity, email, chat, message. If you use your computer to interact with other people using your voice through whatever application. And it analyzes all this information, all these data that it collects from all these different types of activities to identify anomalous behaviors in the workplace. And they claim to use some kind of a machine learning AI algorithm to detect these anomalies. So they train those systems on past behaviors of workers. And if that particular person deviates from this expectation in some fashion, they get flagged from behaving in an abnormal way.
Yeah. And supposedly to like signal people that what might be at risk for leaving the firm, or
So
or even industrial espionage or something like that.
Yeah. So the one from ForcePoint specifically offers to assess whether employees are in financial distress, whether they show decreased productivity or plan to leave their jobs, how they communicate with colleagues, and whether they access obscene content or exhibit negative sentiment, emotion, in conversations with others. So the whole thing is pretty pervasive, right?
Yeah. Can I read off several? And I don't think you saw this study, but there's another study that I saw from Aloisi and DiStefano. It's in Industrial Labor Review. And there's just one place where they list a bunch of applications, software applications. So I'm just going to read off a couple of these because it'll give you a sense of not just how pervasive it is, but how diverse the tools are. So this is a direct quote. The list of software grows by the day. ActiveTrack monitors the programs used and tells managers if the employee is distracted and wasting time on social media. Hub staff takes screenshots of employees' computers every 5 minutes. Time Doctor and TerraMind keep track of every action conducted online. InterGuard compiles a minute-by-minute timeline that considers every piece of data, such as web history and bandwidth utilization, and sends a notification to managers if workers' activities appear suspicious and when they exhibit a combination of flagged behaviors, so that's similar to the one you just discussed. Occupy records when and for how long someone is away from their workstation. Sneak, which is hilarious that they would name the application Sneak. Sneak continually takes photos of colleagues to generate a time card and circulates them to keep the team's mood up. Affinity pairs customers with agents according to demographic data. Pesto synchronizes professional calendars and music playlists to create a sense of community. It also uses a facial recognition feature that can display a worker's real-world emotion on their virtual avatar's face. So that's just a list, right, of some of the all these different vendors that are offering variations on surveillance software.
Yeah. So it goes back to the point that we made at the start, that the scope and depth and breadth of surveillance have like exploded, right? So it used to be like, if we go back 100 years ago or so, that you had a foreman overseeing the workers on the floor and make sure that, you know, all the parts were being constructed appropriately, and, you know, making sure that people clock in at the right time and leave not a minute before they have to leave, or that they're expected to leave, to where we are at today, where it's not just your physical presence and what you do, but also how you feel about this, right? So it goes like into your emotions and affective states during the workday, which I don't know. I mean, I can see why employers would think that it's helpful, because if we understand, there's always a productive reason for doing this, right? That's allegedly ethically warranted. Because if I know that you're suffering, if I know that you're being frustrated, or that things are difficult for you, or that having a conversation with some colleague is making you upset, then I can help you, right? I can move you to a different group. I can you know, assign different tasks to you. I can help you to work in the times that are more appropriate for your needs and things of that nature. So there are, I think, on the face of it, good reasons to use these technologies. But
yeah, well, actually, wait. Even aside from the affective ones, like the ones you just mentioned, are you know, the possible upsides of you know, the things that measure affect. But even just the straight surveillance, I think it's worth noting that there's a business case to be made, right? Which is, how do I make sure that my employees are actually working, right? How do I ensure compliance with regulatory guidelines and make sure that they're not doing criminal activities on my resources, right? By the way, after our last recording, I told myself I have to drop right from the end of every sentence. So I'm going to really work on that. We'll see what kind of progress I can make. So just managing productivity, creating some visibility for managers over their employees and workforce is a legitimate, have legitimate purposes. The issue is, well, as we'll talk through, that there are lines that we have to discern.
Yeah, and it might be constructive to think about this both in terms of practical reasons why we should stop or limit the amount of surveillance that we put in place as employers, and also ethical reasons, like what sort of ethical standards do we feel we need to adhere to in order to create an organization that perhaps we ourselves would want to be employed by. So in terms of practicality, so yes, I completely agree that there are multiple business cases that could be made the use of tools like this. But on the flip side, one of the reports we looked at, this is from Forbes Advisor. They did a survey across, I think it was American workers, and 27% of them said that they will likely quit if their employer decided to monitor their online activity. So this is specific to online activity. 27%.
Yeah. Now that same report, as far as I could tell, said 68% said they were already being monitored in some form, right?
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So there's still, you know, a great deal of resentment or apprehension about being monitored amongst workers, to the point that more than a quarter of them said that they would likely quit. And also, so there's a bunch of different dimensions along which they looked at people's reaction to being monitored. So things like, where is it? Let me find. There it is. Job satisfaction, like how employees monitoring positive and negative, how monitoring rather positively and negatively impacts workers. So job satisfaction, 31% had a positive reaction to this, which is kind of weird.
Actually, this particular report was quite intriguing because the number of people who said who were positive about the monitoring, the surveillance, or felt it made them more productive was quite high.
So look, I didn't see the methodology, but let's just read the numbers and take them for what they are. So 31% thought being monitored had a positive impact on their job it made them more satisfied. 36% had a negative impact, and 33% of third had no impact at all. Relationship with my employer, 30% said it improved their relationship with the employer being monitored. 39% said it had a negative impact, and the rest didn't have any impact at all. Productivity, which arguably is maybe the most important outcome variable here, 39% said it had a positive impact on their productivity. So they felt like they were being more productive when they were monitored. And I wonder, is it because they wanted to satisfy their employer, or is it because it made them more motivated, or I don't know what, like internally motivated? I'm not sure what the reason was, but it's a very high number.
Well, what's your on that point, what's your speculation? To me, the answer seems quite obvious, which is the Panopticon effect.
Yeah, probably.
They're being monitored, therefore they're more likely to keep working and not dilly-dally and, check social media and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I don't see any reason why being monitored would make you like your job more and be more intrinsically motivated to perform well or to be more productive. So 39% said it made them more productive. Only 22% said it made them less productive, and the rest didn't have any impact at all. Yeah, so that's the main thing. Another interesting stat that came out of this report was how monitoring online activity in the workplace makes employees feel. So the most prominent response to this was, I feel micromanaged. So that's 31% of the respondents being micromanaged. I feel like I'm constantly being watched by my employer, which it is pretty much what's happening.
You're
correct. That's 23%. 23% said they felt more productive. But other people felt stressed.
That's a big number, though, too.
Which one?
Again, I feel more productive, right?
Yeah.
Not just I am more productive, but I have this emotional response.
But
that's
there's a downside. But there's a downside to this as well, right? Which is around stress, anxiety, and even physical workplace injuries. So we saw a couple of stats. Let me see if I can find them, and if you have a good view of them in front of you, just shout them out.
Yeah, I have it. Monitoring is used to suppress. Oh, this was suppressing worker voice, right? So negative worker health and well-being associations are highest when electronic monitoring is used to discipline workers or suppress worker voice. So there's this perception, 67% strongly agreed that the monitoring somehow reduces their ability to sort of express their perspective and offer feedback. And 57% said that they felt that monitoring is used to discipline workers.
Yeah. And that corresponds with higher levels of stress, anxiety, and workplace injuries, right?
Yeah, and also statements of mistrust. So the idea is, workers say they trust their employers less, because they think they're being monitored continuously.
Yeah, so there isn't an obvious answer, right? There's not a clear-cut solution here because there's obvious productive reasons to put these things in place. But from a practical business perspective, there's a point beyond which people start responding to these things in a negative way and express their reactions as, stress and anxiety and decreased motivation. And like we said before, even an attitude of thinking about leaving the workplace, leaving their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So I think employers need to be kind of circumspect about the way that they roll these things out. And it might be, I don't know, my intuition is that it has to do with the lack of transparency about how these tools are being used. So,
I had a similar reaction. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's one thing to say to people, look, we're going to watch what you do because we want to make sure that you do your job right and that you're doing the right things, that you're being productive. We're here to help, right? If we see any ways in which we think, you could benefit from more guidance or more advice, more training or whatever the case might be, we're going to be here. We're going to provide you with these resources to make sure that you're successful at your job. I think, if you frame things that way, people, I think, are more likely to respond positively to being monitored. But if you're kind of being quiet about monitoring people in the first place, or if you're not being clear about what sort of data is being collected or how the data is going to be used, that's a big one, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the main reasons I kind of checked out and switched laptops when this application was going to be installed on my machine, because I know what are they going to do with this?
Yeah. I think that's a really important line of inquiry too, because like one of the things that people will often say one of the things I'm surprised by sometimes when I talk to my students and discuss issues about privacy and online life, some of them will say, oh, there's no such thing as privacy anyway. That's not a good reason. That's not a good reason to just say, oh, well, I don't think anything's private anyway, therefore it shouldn't be, right? Or they'll say, well, why do you care if you're not doing anything wrong?
Yeah.
And I always bristle at that response because, you say if you're not doing anything wrong, but that assumes ahead of time how they're going to use the data, right? And what if they suddenly change how they use the data, and you might think you didn't do anything wrong, but they're suddenly, your tone of voice is such that you sound depressed, and we don't want a bunch of depressive people around here. It changes the calculus.
Yeah. Look, somebody out of communist Russia said it, show me the person and I'll show you their crime, or something along these lines. Just because you're fine now, who knows how the standards are going to change in a week or a month or a year. And then, somebody might look back at your behavior from a few months ago and decide that you're an offender, right? Mm-hmm. You exhibited the abnormal behavior and you should be reprimanded and corrected for that.
Yeah. And well, in one of these, and I'm sorry, I don't have the note in front of me, but I know that in one of these papers that we read, they did say something in the neighborhood of 20%, or more than 20% of employees in one study said that their the monitored data or their online behavior had been used in their annual evaluation.
Oh, I missed that one. Oh,
yeah. I'll when we put up our recording, I'll drop the stat in somewhere. But that it was actually used in annual evaluations, that it was used for disciplinary measures and things like that. That would seem to imply some distrust, or I think that would engender some distrust.
Yeah. So, like I said, I think employers need to be more considered in how they implement these tools. And a couple of the studies that we looked at had an interesting insight, or a couple of different insights, about how different types of employees respond to being monitored in the workplace. I can talk to one of them. So there was this one paper, I'm not sure if this is the one you were reaching for just now. It's called Bosses Without Hearts, Sociodemographic and Cross-Cultural Determinants of Attitudes Towards Emotional AI in the Workplace. This is from
Mantello et al.
And colleagues, 2023. It was published in AI and Society, the journal AI and Society. And what they did was a survey of over 1,000 people, of job seekers from 48 different countries, right? So it's a large international sample of job seekers, of university students. And what they found was that students with higher income, students who were men and business majors, were more likely to have a less worried attitude towards emotional AI in the workplace. So if you're a man, if you were a business major and you came from a wealthy background, you were more likely to be less concerned about emotional AI. So the flip side of this is that if you're a woman from a low-income background, you're more likely to be concerned about this.
Yeah, well, and actually, just to augment that, in a number of the studies that we looked at, it makes it quite clear that the negative emotional reactions to any surveillance, not just the emotional AI, but any surveillance, is disproportionately borne by people from marginalized groups. So women within the workplace often, but also people from ethnic minorities. So marginalized groups have greater anxiety over surveillance. And I think that aligns perfectly with that stat that you just gave.
I guess that's true. Another interesting aspect that I hadn't thought about at all is religious background and how it corresponds with attitudes towards emotional AI. So atheists were most likely to have the least concerned attitude about emotional AI as compared to religious people. And within religious people, have you seen that? I was going to tackle you
I
there.
think that was also in that same study, that Mantello et al. Study. Yeah, I was kind of surprised by that.
So Muslims were the most likely to have a negative attitude to emotional AI, to surveillance by emotional AI, and Buddhists were the least likely to be worried about it. What do you
But
mean?
even Buddhists were higher than atheists, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Religiosity was a signal for greater anxiety over the use of these tools.
Yeah, and I think Christians were somewhere in the middle between Buddhists and Muslims.
Yeah, so this surprised me.
Why is that?
This could make a good debate on this particular call, since we represent the two sides of the spectrum. Well, I would have thought religiosity would not necessarily. I mean, I guess we could think through the reasoning, but even their hypothesis had been that religiosity would lower their tolerance, the tolerance of people for this emotional AI use. And maybe I'm thinking more on the surveillance piece, but it surprised me because those of us who are religious think somebody's watching us already all the time.
That's true. Although the Buddhists, do they believe in that as well? I think it's quite different.
Yeah, I don't know about the Buddhists. Yeah, maybe not the Buddhists.
Yeah. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting finding. And I don't know if it would be sinister for employers to keep these things in mind when they employ these tools, but it's something to be aware of. Know your workforce, know who your employees are, and try to have the right conversations with them based on these characteristics, perhaps. Another big one was cultural background. Mm-hmm. Right, so Europeans compared to Asians, for instance, there was a marked difference in their attitudes towards AI, and so, as perhaps could be expected, Europeans were by far more concerned about the deployment of AI tools for emotional surveillance in the workplace as compared to Asians. Actually,
East Asians in particular, I think, had the highest tolerance for it. Right.
Yes. So East Asians was distinct from Southeast Asia. So who do you think was included in East Asia? Was it Japan?
I would think Japan and China.
I thought
China would be East Asia.
Okay, so what would be Southeast Asia? India?
What used to be called India would be South Asia. Southeast Asia would be Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia.
Okay. Well, your geographical knowledge is impressive.
Thanks. Myanmar. Anyway, that was my intuition in reading that.
Yeah. So, yeah, again, I think that's certainly something to keep in mind if you're an organization, specifically if you're a business that have offices or locations in different geographical places, right? Because
that's another one where I wonder somewhat about the mechanism. So if China is included, we know that currently in China there are surveillance mechanisms that exist, the wide use of cameras at a societal level. There's this social credit system that's been adopted for a number of years. Right. So it's almost my read on that was in that culture, people are accustomed to being observed somewhat.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty deeply ingrained into the fabric of society there that you do need to maintain a level of productivity, even social productivity, to be considered a good member of
Contributor
society.
to the harmony of society.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just an extension of everything else, and it's probably, completely natural for most people, for many people there anyway.
So yeah, I do want to just delve a little deeper on the emotional AI front specifically.
Right.
So because again, I think the surveillance mechanisms in general, as we talked about, they have some upside. They have some fairly clear downsides, but they're not unprecedented. In one of these studies, I know it was referred to as sort of like Neo-Taylorism. So I think we've talked about Taylorism before, but this was Frederick Taylor. Was that the guy's name? Frederick Taylor, back in the early 20th century, started this movement called scientific management, where he tried to take complex work tasks and break them down into minute bites to make them very repeatable. And the perception, I think, that grew out of that, initially people thought, oh, this is great and promising. But then over time, people said it's diminishing people's ownership of their own work, and it's dehumanizing and that sort of thing. And I think with a lot of this surveillance, people are sort of seeing this might be a Neo-Taylorism, a case of Neo-Taylorism. But with the emotional AI, which again, we have talked about in past episodes, maybe it takes it to a different level altogether, because it's monitoring, your emotional states, your tone, the tone of your voice, your facial expressions, micro expressions in your face, and making conclusions about your productivity, likelihood to be productive in the future, intentions to leave, unhappiness, all these things, all these conclusions that are being drawn based on that data, the data collection and analysis.
Yeah. So I have a couple of thoughts about this. On a practical level, I think organizations, businesses need to be careful with how they use these tools. Firstly, because they're not accurate. So it's famously known by now that facial recognition technology is not 100% accurate. And whatever it is that they use, either reading people's faces or voices, there's a lot of room for misinterpretation. And if you act based on misinterpretations, you're likely to, enforce bad policies or develop bad strategies that are based on false information. It seemed like you were going to say something.
Yeah.
Are you taking any issue with what I'm saying?
Just a little bit. So you said facial recognition is inaccurate. Facial recognition technology is actually super accurate, but that's just the recognition piece. In terms of imputing emotion to it, I think that's the more open question.
Yeah, but
particularly because we all have different ways of expressing emotion.
But even facial recognition technology is not uniformly accurate across different groups in the population. So it's more accurate for white men, but less accurate for Black females, for instance.
Right. Okay. Yep.
But you're right. To infer emotions from people's faces is a different story altogether. So yeah, the level of accuracy is debatable. And like we said before, you're always going to run the risk of generating negative responses from people who are being surveilled and monitored in that way. So I think managers have to, to run these calculations in their heads and think whether it's worth it. What are the benefits from using tools like this? And what are we possibly losing from their deployment?
And this is the one where, my privacy hackles get set off, what happens with hackles? It raises my hackles more than anything else, because now you're really trying to creep inside people's heads. And that's a huge concern to me.
Well, okay, so that goes beyond the practical issue to a more ethical consideration. Right. Oh, wait, but there's another practical issue that came out of another study that we looked at. So let me quickly give them their due. So this is a study called Emotion AI at Work, Implications for Workplace Surveillance, Emotional Labor, and Emotional Intimacy. This is from, God, I hope I'm pronouncing their name properly, Romich, Schaub, and Andalibi. That's a 2023 paper that was published in the Conference on Human Factors in Computing Systems. And they did an interviews with a bunch of adult workers. And one of the things that they found, which is, it makes perfect sense when you think about this, is that when people are subject to emotional surveillance, they conduct what they call emotional labor, to put on a face and make the system or whatever is surveilling them feel or believe or interpret their behaviors as if they're acting and feeling in specific ways as per the expectations. But they're just putting on a face, right? It's not what
Put
they're
on a
actually
happy
feeling.
face.
Yeah, put on a happy face.
Yeah.
So they're pretending for the sake of appearing to be compliant with the expectations,
Yeah.
which is not helpful because, again, it produces false information. And I'm sure it's emotionally draining, and I'm sure it's a distraction from what they actually have to do in the workplace. So from a purely practical perspective, this is not a useful thing to do.
Yeah, it would certainly be emotional draining. I would raise one caveat. I think that study's interesting and it's thought-provoking. They had an N of 15.
Yeah, but they did interviews,
So,
right? They're in-depth
yeah,
interviews.
yeah,
Right. So it's not meant to be, statistically representative. But,
yeah,
that's beside the point. But ethically, I think you're right. Ethically, I think emotional surveillance is, it's a questionable practice when used in the workplace, because traditionally there was some sort of an agreement between employers and employees. We're going to pay you a bunch of money, and you're going to do this for us, and you're going to leave at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're going to have your private life, and then you're going to come back the next morning, and that's going to be it. We don't know who you are as a person. We don't care really that much about who you are as a person and what you do outside of the workplace. And, your personality is fine, but we only care about it in as much as it impacts your work here. But we're not going to try and infiltrate your spiritual life or your emotional life or your relationship with your loved ones, with your family, or what you do outside of work, or what posts you have on Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram. But that's a different that's a different category now that we're dealing with, right? Because now we do care about all this, and we want to infiltrate.
Now you're making me rethink my whole stance.
Do I
Because
really?
you're painting you're painting that previous world as somehow more desirable. But, you're saying we don't care who you are. We don't care about your personality. We don't care what you do in your off time. But, I think in a community, you want people to feel like they can bring their whole selves to the workplace and
No, sure, yes,
not be an impersonal cog.
no, but my sense was the relationship between employers and employees was much more transactional,
Yeah.
which I guess
Yeah.
can be interpreted as being cold and instrumental. But there's a positive side to it as well, which is that you're not going to surveil me and try to control me through a deep understanding of my emotions and affective states in the workplace and beyond. Because there's something very sinister about having this, profound, intrusive gaze, not just into, your physical body and what you do in the workplace and your conversations and your interactions, but how you feel, like your emotions. Yeah. I mean, emotions are meant to be private unless you choose to externalize them. And once employers start, scanning these emotions for productive ends, I think that changes fundamentally the relationship between employers and employees. And like we said before, oftentimes this is done without the explicit consent or even knowledge of workers.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that occurs to me here is that it can really induce some clear bias. So there are people who have reacted things in different ways. So think about someone who has Asperger's or is on the autistic spectrum, right? Their emotional responses or their reaction to certain activities is going to look unconventional. What's, this category of folks that are often called neurodivergent, where they are not necessarily in the norm in terms of their emotional response to things. Well, their responses are going to look fundamentally different. And if that gets interpreted as problematic, then that's creating bias against them in the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, those machine learning systems are famously known for, being more accurate in predicting the behavior of instances or people or interactions that were prevalent in the training data. But if you only have a few people with a certain condition or neurodivergent, then statistically speaking, these systems are going to be less accurate for predicting the behaviors or the emotions of those individuals. So yeah, and the level of accuracy decreases the less common the behavior is or the condition is. So yeah, that would create bias against underrepresented groups of workers, which is another ethical issue. Okay, main takeaways. What do you think, Sean? If you're a manager, do you use these tools? Do you try to surveil people in the workplace? And if yes, to what degree and how?
So I think that some of the tools make perfect sense to me, right? Like simple login systems where people, you can know status of team members on a daily basis, so that it enables that collaboration, and it sort of like informs collaboration between team members. Seem unproblematic to me. My key takeaway is that firms exploring new tools should clearly identify how it's going to be used and be open about what that is, right? So don't hide the ball with regard to how it's going to be used. What is it going to be used for? And part of this is sort of a tool for ethical decision making, because if you want to hide the ball, this is what used to be called the Shusher's test, right? If there's something you don't want other people to know or your employees to know, that's probably a pretty good tell that it's ethically questionable or problematic. So be clear about how the tools are going to be used, what objectives it's intended for. Be open about that so that the employees understand those uses, and then stick to that. Sure. Don't start exploring alternative uses for the technology that you're just considering because it's possible.
Yeah, I was going to say that last point as well. I think it's really important to have a business case, right? Know what you're going to use this technology for and what business aims it actually serves. And I think organizations oftentimes fall into this trap, and they feel like they have to use this AI tool or that new fancy technology or this surveillance application, whatever it is, just because they feel everybody else is doing it. And just because it's now affordable because prices are dropping or whatever the case is. So we're going to put this in place, and we'll see what we might use that for and what kind of purpose it might serve in the future. And in the meantime, we're just going to collect a ton of data about our workers and see what we want to do with it. Well, that's a recipe for unproductive results, I would argue. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think having a clear business aim, a clear business case for the use of these tools is really crucial. And like you said, I think it's really important to be open and communicate those aims to workers so that they understand exactly what's being collected, what it's being collected for, and how it's going to be used, how the data is going to be used. And I think if people do that, they're more likely to get productive results from these tools.
Yeah. A second takeaway for me is as firms explore different tools, they should think very clearly about the degree to which it's going to disproportionately affect certain employees as opposed to others, and essentially create bias. If the technology is invasive enough that it's going to tap into these differences that we see in the literature in terms of differences between people, differences between classes of people, then you would have to accept the fact that you are inducing bias against certain classes of your employees. And in particular, more often than not, those are people from marginalized or vulnerable groups. And so anything that skirts that line, I don't see any upside there.
Yeah. I think managers need to be, I think there's an educational piece here, because I think many people feel like AI is kind of a panacea, and it's, this great, smart, objective, rational technology that can give me access to these, it would take me to the next step of productivity or competitiveness. And data is untapped, it's underutilized, and if I'm only going to have more of it, it's going to help me to help my organization be more competitive and more productive and more profitable. But yeah, I think people really need to understand well what AI systems can and cannot do, what they actually are, how they actually work, why bias is almost impossible to get rid of despite people's best efforts, and how it's distributed across the population, because it's not evenly distributed, like we said before, right?
Yeah, well, and I think maybe we've talked about this in a previous episode, but not only is it not evenly distributed, it gives people the patina of objectivity, right? Or they have the impression that these tools, because they're based on data, are somehow objective.
Yeah.
But if they're built and trained off of data that has bias inherent in it, then it's going to reproduce those biases. And so even though you feel like it's objective because it's based in data, you're wrong, right? It is not purely objective. And so you really have to evaluate it with a critical perspective.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting examples of this happening, even in workplace environments. So one famous case is from Amazon, who used a hiring algorithm, and they trained the algorithm on their own data sets. And because they used to hire mostly men in the past, that's what the algorithm learned from the data, and it prioritized men over women in the application process, and that became a real issue for them when it came out.
I think it actually, like they were getting ranked lists, and it basically downranked almost all women, so that it wasn't until one of the hiring managers said, why are we only interviewing men, that they realized what the algorithm was spitting out. Yeah, and scrapped it.
And there are many other examples from different domains. Okay, I think we've reached the end of the line here for today. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
I got to get a new light. I'm still looking at this camera thinking this lighting's terrible. So
hey, can you move your head a little bit to the left or to the right so that everybody can see what's behind? There you go, the American flag. Awesome.
USA. Yeah, nice.
All right, Sean, that's been highly educational. I appreciate the insights. Let's do it again soon.
Good discussion.
Okay, see ya.